responsible for overseeing the Council's working method, you will agree with us that serious consideration has to be given on how to optimally utilize the Council's limited resources, considering the number of sessions dedicated to this subject. It is also concerning that our program of work has not been adopted owing to this very same subject. This issue requires constructive dialogue driven by our collective desire to find solutions. As we enter the yearly high point of our multilateral calendar, Mozambique calls for a committed position for a political and negotiated solution to this conflict, grounded in the ideals of the UN Charter and our mutual responsibility for international peace and security. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of China.
Mr. President, I thank ASG, Mr. Jenka, for his briefing. China's position on the question of Ukraine has been consistent and clear. We have always believed that the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries should be safeguarded, that the purposes and principles of the UN Charter should be respected, that the legitimate security concerns of all parties should be taken seriously, and that all efforts conducive to the peaceful resolution of the crisis should be supported. At present, as the crisis in Ukraine drags on, tensions on the ground remain high, and the spillover effects are spreading more rapidly. The Security Council should work with a greater sense of responsibility and urgency to find ways to achieve ceasefire and restore peace at an early date. Priority should be given to making good use of the mediation tools granted by the Charter to promote the implementation of various peace initiatives and to leverage the core role of the international collective security mechanism. The crisis in Ukraine has complex causes, and there's no easy fix. It takes concerted efforts of all parties. No matter how challenging it is, the door of political settlement cannot be closed, and efforts to promote ceasefire and peace talks cannot relent. The process of diplomatic negotiations cannot stall. China stands ready to strengthen dialogue and communication with all parties and will continue to make constructive efforts to promote the political settlement of the Ukrainian crisis. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, we regret that the Albanian presidency has followed in the disastrous footsteps of its Western colleagues and has used Rule 37 to invite 5 states, Ukraine, Czech Republic, Italy, Poland, Estonia, and together with the EU, that makes 6 delegations, even though it is quite obvious that there is no added value to their statements, which all follow the same general EU-NATO line. What is the point of making today's meeting an open debate if Albania intends to hold one on September 20th anyway? This approach devalues discussions in the Council. When we saw the topic on which today's meeting was requested, we were pleasantly surprised by the desire to commemorate the anniversary of the referendums on the accession of the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, Zaporizhia and Kherson regions to Russia. Frankly, we ourselves had been thinking that it might be worth telling the Council about life in these new constituent subjects of our country. However, it seems that having declared referendums as the topic of our meeting, Albania and the United States have confused them with the current elections to the regional parliament of our new subjects, or rather they intended to use them as a pretense for new attacks on our country, even though Western countries who mentor others about so-called genuine democratic values should be better informed about various forms of the expression of popular will than anyone. We know, however, that when Western interests are at play, such minor details as referendums, elections, and the opinion of ordinary citizens in general are not taken into account by our former Western partners. That was the case in Kosovo, for example, where instead of a free expression of will, there was simply a declaration of independence adopted by an interim self-governing authorities, which had clearly exceeded their remit. Back then, the same countries which now criticized the Russian referendums, argued that Kosovo had the right to secede from the Serbian state due to threat of a serious violation of the rights of Kosovo Albanians, even though by that point nothing had truly threatened them for a long time. Unlike the situation with Kosovo, the rights and the very lives of the people of Donbass, Kherson, and Zaporizhia were and continue to be under threat from the actions of the same criminal regime which since 2014 has been shelling peaceful neighborhoods and cities in Donbass, and which, with the connivance of the United States and its allies, has declared war on everything Russian and is actively promoting neo-Nazi ideologies in Ukraine. The only way to provide the residents of these regions liberated from the Kiev regime with protection and certainty in their future is through a clear legal status of these territories and their inclusion in the Russian Federation, just as in 2014 the reunification of Crimea with Russia was ensured even as Kiev unequivocally threatened that region with Ukrainization or reprisals. On September 27, 2022, the long-awaited expression of popular will took place, and its results spoke for themselves. The overwhelming majority of those who voted, 99%, the DPR, 98%, in the LPR, 93%, in Zaporizhia, and 87% in the Kherson region, made a free and informed choice in favor of our country. Despite the difficult security situation and the provocations of the Kiev regime, the overwhelming majority of voters decided to go to the polls, from 76% in the Kherson region to 97% in the DPR. The referendums were held in full compliance with the norms and principles of international law, no matter how much our Western opponents may try to prove otherwise. The decisions of these plebiscites reflect the right of peoples to self-determination, which, according to the 1970 Declaration of Principles of International Law, may take the form of the establishment of a sovereign and independent state or the free association or integration with an independent state. More than 100 international observers from Italy, Germany, Venezuela, Latvia, and other countries who followed the process also recognized the results as legitimate. For the residents of these new regions, this was not just a decision on legal status. They exercised their inalienable right to speak their native language and teach their children in that language. And on Victory Day, which is sacred for our people, to pay tribute to those who fought to liberate their land from the Nazis and not those who collaborated with them and committed horrific crimes. The people of the DPR and LPR had been waiting for that opportunity for 8 years under incessant shelling from the Kiev regime, which since 2014 had set a course for the physical extermination of undesirable residents in the southeast of the country. Ukrainian authorities openly declared Russian and Russian-speaking citizens of Donbass non-human and specimens. In one of his interviews, Vladimir Zelensky suggested that they get out of Ukraine and go to Russia. And the residents of the DPR, LPR, Kherson region, and Zaporizhia followed his cynical recommendation, returning to their homeland and taking the lands on which their ancestors had lived for centuries with them. The best testament to the voluntary accession of these territories to Russia is the active participation of their residents in the life of the country and national processes, support for efforts aimed at the economic and social revival of these new Russian regions and restoring their indisputable centuries-old Russian identity. We recall the numerous prophecies about the emergence of guerrilla movements in these territories after they become part of Russia. The reality is that the only ones trying to unsuccessfully stir up trouble are a handful of saboteur groups sent in from Ukraine, which the same local residents helped to identify and neutralize. This is, of course, a huge disappointment for the Zelensky regime, which now has a chance to find out how the people of Ukraine really feel about its criminal policies. Of course, the choice of former Ukrainian citizens was also influenced by the achievements of Crimea after it was reunited with Russia. Over the past 9 years, life there has changed for the better. People live without fear for their lives. The economy is developing. Infrastructure is being built. Throughout these years, we have been sincerely investing in the well-being of this region, just as we will continue contributing to the development of Donbass and other territories that Kiev tried and continues to try to turn into ruins. It is clear that other regions of Ukraine are closely following the experience of the LPR, DPR, Kherson, and Zaporizhia regions as well. They have gotten a good glimpse of the true face of the Kiev regime over this period. It is enough to just reference the Human Rights Watch report, which admitted that Ukrainian armed forces shelled certain areas of the Kharkiv region with cluster munitions, leading to mass civilian deaths. Just as the Kiev regime at one time fired on Bucha near Kyiv, later tried to pass off civilian casualties of the shelling as victims of Russian occupiers and laying out the bodies on the streets of the village. It is no surprise that as our Russian troops approach the Kupiansky district, the local administration has admitted that nearly all its residents refuse to evacuate and prefer to wait for our soldiers. And in general, the majority of Ukrainians understand full well that the threat to them comes not from Russia's actions, but from the criminal policies of the Zelensky regime. Currently, this is taking the form of the mass drafting of soldiers, which has long been called conscription to the grave in Ukraine. The fact is that, as is well known, NATO is waging a hybrid war in Ukraine with Russia to the last Ukrainian, and they're already beginning to run out of Ukrainians after a failed counter-offensive. Ukrainians no longer want to end up in a meat grinder, and draft officers are trying to catch anyone they can on the street. Information has emerged that the EU is ready to extradite men of military age to Kiev, thereby once again flouting its own principles and values. Ukrainian men quickly realize this, and a campaign is gaining momentum on social network advocating to move refugees to Russia, where several million Ukrainians have already found shelter. Further comments are unnecessary. Dear colleagues, new regions are actively integrating into our country's life. We have approved a comprehensive program for the socioeconomic development of these federal subjects, which includes rebuilding infrastructure, implementing federal programs and projects, implementing social support measures, relaunching key industries and businesses, rebuilding production facilities, and creating conditions for further growth, and most importantly, improving the well-being of citizens and protecting their rights. Russia has consistently addressed the problems and will continue to address the problems that have accumulated in these regions during the time they were not part of our country. In 2023, more than 700 kilometers of road were repaired, 177 educational institutions rebuilt, and on September 1st, more than 1,250 schools began operating in the 4 new regions. Liberated Mariupol, which still remembers the brutal crimes of Ukrainian nationalists, is actively being rebuilt. On September 1st, the grand openings of 2 universities as well as 25 schools and 26 kindergartens were commemorating, including a new modern school built from scratch for 1,100 students. Of course, in order for these 4 regions to fully integrate into Russia legally and administratively, they need normal authorities that have the same powers as in other subjects of the Russian Federation. From today and until September 10th, which is the single general voting day across our country, elections of representatives to regional parliaments and municipal bodies are taking place across all polling stations, and residents' active political stance can already be seen based on the results of early and extraterritorial voting. Organizers and participants of the electoral process have to deal with the most severe conditions of endless shelling and provocations from Ukraine. From August 31st to September 4th alone, Ukrainian armed forces fired at the Donetsk metropolitan area over 120 times using 50 high-millimeter Western-style shells, including cluster ammunitions. As a result, 63 men and women were wounded, and a 6-year-old girl died in the Kiev region of Donetsk. This is, of course, not something any of our Western colleagues have mentioned today. Despite threats to their lives, election commission workers are being sent to villages and hamlets where fighting is currently ongoing. In the DPR, these groups have traveled to the most dangerous settlements, Gorlovka, Volnovacha, Yasinovatia, and several areas of Donetsk and Makiivka. Western countries and the UN Secretariat are well aware of these place names, but they bashfully prefer not to mention them, whereas in our country they resonate with the pain of hundreds of civilians killed and injured, killed by Western long-range weapons, in their own homes, in shops and cafes, in public places, in other words, in civilian facilities near which there are no military targets. A responsibility for their deaths lies not only with the Kiev regime, but also with its Western sponsors who supply artillery systems and other heavy weapons to Ukrainian nationalists. They are also making a tidy profit from others' misfortune in this, and therefore are not interested in a peaceful solution to the Ukrainian crisis. We will address this again at the next council meeting on September 12th. Dear colleagues, it is the inhumane crimes of the Kiev regime, its maniacal and hopeless desire to deprive the Russian people of their Russian identity, that became the main reason due to which the residents of Donbass, Lugansk, and Zaporizhia are actively and consciously voting for their future together with Russia. Kiev lost them in the same way as it lost Crimea, having drawn no conclusions from its obvious mistakes. We see that it is unable to draw those conclusions even now, bringing its inglorious and inevitable end closer. Mr. President, some Western delegations and UN Secretariat representatives mentioned yesterday's strike on Konstantinovka in the DNR. This is indeed a horrific crime as a result of the rocket strike on a market. 16 people died and 32 were injured. But we're convinced that you will soon forget about this incident, having understood, just as was the case on the Kramatorsk strike in April last year, what a horrific crime and a horrible provocation carried out by Ukraine you're covering up for. You don't need to be a ballistic expert to be able to use the available video materials which have been posted by the Zelensky themselves to show that the missile came from a direction where there are only Ukrainian positions. And Western media, having disseminated this video, they quickly begin to editing the video where the rocket hits a car and shows the direction where it came from. However, it was too late and the truth came out. Another horrific lie that the Western media is using to cover up Ukrainian provocations, and which traditionally are tied to the visit of a high-ranking official, in this case, Anthony Blinken. We are sure that this was carried out in order to give the dying regime a new dose of finance and weapons. This was the same pattern behind the vile provocation in Bucha, and there will no doubt be further Nazi-style incidents in the future. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, dear colleagues, I thank ASG Miroslav Jenca for the update on developments in Ukraine, and I also welcome the permanent representative of Ukraine to this meeting. Brazil has expressed concern with the organization of regional elections in Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia. Such actions raise tensions and further undermine the prospects for ending the conflict and finding lasting peace. We remain convinced that the dynamics on the battlefield will not bring a solution to this war, let alone lasting peace and stability. That is why Brazil insists on its call for the de-escalation of hostilities as a first step and for the establishment of negotiations either directly or through the other peaceful means described in Article 33 of the United Nations Charter. Those means have provided fair, effective, and lasting solutions in several other international disputes. There is no reason they should not be used in this conflict. Only a political solution, one that takes into account the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations and the legitimate security concerns of all parties, will bring lasting peace. Any solution must also ensure full respect for the civil and political rights of local populations, including ethnic and linguistic minorities. Mr. President, last but not least, let me remind that substantial and negative effects of this war continue to be felt in many parts of the world, especially in the developing countries. Economic growth is hampered, development compromised, and food security threatened. We are still hopeful that a revised Black Sea Grain Initiative will be possible and that diplomacy will be given a chance once more. Brazil's message is clear. All actions that make peace ever more elusive must stop. Negotiations must be pursued, even if politically very difficult, and no one doubts they will be complex and difficult. We should channel our efforts towards an approach that brings us closer to ending the conflict and the suffering and loss it entails. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Brazil for their statement. Et je donne la parole au
And I now give the floor to the representative of Gabon. Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Assistant Secretary General Miroslav Jenca for his briefing. Mr. President, in the current context of intensifying fighting on various fronts of the war in Ukraine, the decision to organize local and municipal elections in the territories of Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson on September 10th, 2023 is not one that will contribute to ease tensions and even so to the prospects of ending the war. After 18 months of fierce fighting and destruction, The efforts of the belligerents in the international community must now turn towards the search for de-escalation in order to put an end to the suffering of populations on the ground and to the consequences of a deadly war whose shockwaves impact multiple countries around the world. My country reaffirms its commitment to respecting the territorial integrity of each state and stresses the importance for the parties to adhere to General Assembly Resolution of October 12, 2022. We once again call on the parties to prioritize dialogue and negotiation to end the war and ensure peaceful coexistence. In this light, it is fundamental for the warring parties to refrain from any stances or actions likely to exacerbate tensions and fuel the escalation of violence. My country emphasizes that the United Nations Charter, which constitutes the bedrock of our coexistence, must remain the compass for all parties in terms of respecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of each member of the international community. We will continue to emphasize the requirement for unhindered access of humanitarian aid to populations in need while encouraging all initiatives that aim to bring parties to the table in order to consider ways out of this conflict which has lasted too long. I thank you. I thank the representative of Gabon for his statement.
I shall now make a further statement in my capacity as representative of Albania. I started my national statement today by mentioning the discrepancy between the Russian narrative and the reality. We heard more of the same today. The Russian delegation tried to make a parallel with the Republic of Kosovo, with what is happening in parts of territory of Ukraine. Nothing could be less accurate and farther from the truth. Kosovo cannot and will not be used as a fig leaf or a camouflage for Russia's military aggression against Ukraine and its attempt for annexation. Everybody knows that Kosovo became independent after a bloody war and a long international peace process and talks to which Russia was also a part of. The International Court of Justice was asked and responded that the declaration of independence of the Republic of Kosovo was in line with international law. And I wish Russia conformed with the ICJ rulings in the very same way. And there is one issued in March 2022 ordering Russia to stop the war, which we hope Russia will abide with. I have said it so many times, and I will repeat shortly, but it is important that Kosovo and Serbia do not fight. They meet, they talk, they are bound by a process of dialogue, not an easy one, but a real and substantial one to solve pending issues and march toward their common future in peace and cooperation. As to comments regarding Rule 37, I want to assure our Russian colleagues that the Presidency is committed to maintaining an orderly conduct of business of the Council. The Presidency, in full respect of the provisional rules of procedure and Note 507, including past practices of this Council and in prior consultations with the members of the Council, has accepted the request for non-members of the Council to participate in this meeting. Thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council, and I give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. Distinguished members of the Security Council, Assistant Secretary General Miroslav Yencha, I also note the continued occupation by the Putin's envoy of the permanent seat of the Soviet Union. On Wednesday, his country added yet another horrific crime to the endless list of atrocities that one day will bring the representatives of Putin's regime, including those in this chamber, to the dock of International Tribunal. I thank those Security Council members who has this week expressed their condemnation and condolences over Russia's terrorist attack on civilian facilities in the city of Konstantinivka, Donetsk region, a local market, stores, and a pharmacy. At least 16 people were killed, including a child, and 37 were wounded as a result of this attack. Needless to say, they were civilians. Another mass murder committed by Russians as a revenge for the failures of their troops on the battlefield. Mr. President, the Ukrainian forces continue to undermine the Russian grip on the occupied territories and will persist in doing so until all sovereign territories of my country are liberated. The desperate Russia's attempt to legitimize its illegal occupation of the Ukrainian territories by organizing an outright election farce just serve as a proof that Russia realizes the inevitability of its defeat. One could hardly qualify in other way the fake elections to Russian puppet structures in the temporarily occupied parts of Ukraine in Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, Zaporizhia, Autonomous Republic of Crimea, and the city of Sevastopol that take place on 8 to 10 September 2023. As terrorists force hostages to read a prepared text on camera, Russia makes the civilian population that has stayed in the occupied territories to participate in staged free expression of will. It is crucial to remember that Russia resorted to mockery of free will since the very beginning of its aggression against Ukraine back in 2014. On March 16, 2014, Russia held so-called referendum in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol that was not authorized by Ukraine. The UN General Assembly responded to this crime by adopting resolution on territorial integrity of Ukraine. In its resolution of March 27, 2014, the UN General Assembly underscored that the referendum held in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol on March 16, 2014, having no validity, cannot form the basis for any alteration of the status of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea or of the city of Sevastopol. Last September, Russia conducted other sham referendum that time in the parts of Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia regions. In response, the UN General Assembly adopted on October 12, 2022, by an absolute majority of 143 votes versus 5 negative votes, the resolution Territorial Integrity of Ukraine, upholding the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. Mr. President, the General Assembly clearly declared that the unlawful actions of the Russian Federation with regard to the illegal so-called referendums held from 23 to 27 September 2022 in parts of the Donetsk, Kherson, Lugansk, and Zaporizhia regions of Ukraine, that in part are or have been under the temporarily military control of the Russian Federation and the subsequent attempted illegal annexation of these regions have no validity under international law and do not form the basis for any alteration of the status of these regions of Ukraine. Let me remind that the demand by the General Assembly is yet to be met by Russia, notably the demand that they withdraw all of its military forces from the territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. End of quote. We firmly reject and strongly condemn the illegal actions of the Russian occupation forces in the temporarily occupied parts of the territories of Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson regions, the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, and the city of Sevastopol. We do not and will never recognize these illegal actions and emphasize that their results will be null and void and cannot produce legal effects under international law. Likewise, any activity of illegally created so-called administrations and so-called local authorities in the temporarily occupied areas of Ukraine will have no legal effect and will not alter the internationally recognized status of these areas as integral parts of sovereign territory of Ukraine. We call on the international community to condemn the use of the Russian election system on the territory of another state. We also urge not to recognize the so-called results of these fake elections, legitimacy of so-called authorities and officials to be appointed by the occupying power under the guise of local representatives, as well as legitimacy of any decisions to be made by the occupying power on behalf of these authorities. All those who are involved in holding these fake elections will bear responsibility. The competent authorities of Ukraine are already taking measures to track them down and bring them to justice. We are also convinced that the international community should respond to this deliberate violation of international law and the UN Charter by strengthening pressure on the aggressor, in particular by imposing new tough sanctions. Let me reiterate that illegal voting in the occupied territories of Ukraine poses an existential threat to the United Nations and its charter. All these illegal actions are putting global peace and security at risk. We do not condemn today's actions of the Russian Federation, then we condone, if we do not condemn today's actions, then we condone similar blatant attacks on any and all of the countries tomorrow. Protecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all UN member states, regardless of their size and power, is our collective duty and a core principle of the UN Charter. As I said on October 12, 2022, there were only 4 countries that voted against the UN Charter, while 143 firmly stood in its defense and in support of Ukraine's territorial integrity within the internationally recognized borders. Today, in this chamber, not a single country in the Security Council aligned itself with yet another violation of the UN Charter by the Russian Federation. Russia is alone and isolated. I would like to express our particular gratitude for the stated position on the planned so-called elections to the delegations of Albania, the United States, France, Ecuador, Ghana, Malta, Switzerland, Japan, United Arab Emirates, United Kingdom, Brazil, and Gabon. Enough is enough. Every day, if not every hour, Russia proves that its actions are completely incompatible with the purpose and principles of the UN Charter, let alone with criteria of membership in the UN and in the Security Council in particular. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Estonia.
Mr. President, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the 3 Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and my own country, Estonia. We also align ourselves with a statement of the European Union. Thank you for convening today's Security Council briefing. I would also like to thank Assistant Secretary General Miroslav Jenca for your valuable insights and for your principled position. Mr. President, the so-called elections held by Russia in the illegally occupied territories of Ukraine are yet another grave violation of the UN Charter and the independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Let me remind you that last year the General Assembly overwhelmingly condemned Russia's attempted illegal annexation of Ukrainian regions. Whether Russia likes it or not, Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk and Zaporizhia regions, along with Crimea and Sevastopol, are and will remain an integral part of Ukraine. By organizing elections on Ukrainian territory, Russia makes a shameless mockery of its position as a permanent member of the Security Council. And Kremlin is following a playbook that they have used in other occupied territories. They threaten and intimidate civilians to vote in sham elections with hopes to legitimize their occupation and suppress Ukrainian resistance. These elections, organized by the occupying power, violate international humanitarian and human rights law, including Geneva Convention. Mr. President, all of the territories where the so-called elections are being conducted have witnessed Russian war crimes. Ask yourself how you would vote in such elections if you family members had been held at gunpoint and your home occupied by Russian armed forces or mercenaries with criminal track record, while you are witnessing new atrocities on a daily basis. On Wednesday, at least 16 innocent civilians were brutally killed and many more wounded by Russian shelling against the market in Konstantinovka, a town in Donetsk Oblast just 30 kilometers from the front line. Mr. President, Russia aims to portray the so-called elections as a triumph of democracy in occupied territories. In reality, there is nothing more undemocratic. The strict occupation regime is upheld by Russian military and Russian special services. FSB officers placed in leadership positions organize their occupied territories' forced integration into Russia, according to Moscow's instructions. The people in the Russian-occupied areas of Ukraine are experiencing extrajudicial killings, large-scale repressions, deportations, and severe aggression. Ukrainians are being forcibly Russified and stripped of local resources, a Russian tactic that the Baltic states know all too well. Credible reports, including by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, found evidence of widespread violations of the rights to freedom of opinion and peaceful assembly, and of new sanctions for criticizing the Russian military. In conclusion, Ukrainians living in the occupied territories have staunchly continued to resist to the occupied forces or are looking for ways to leave. And I believe it is our obligation to support and speak up for them. We will never recognize the holding of these sham elections nor their results, and we will make sure that those involved, including the Russian criminal leadership, will be held accountable. We once again call upon Russia to immediately, completely, and unconditionally withdraw all of its troops and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. And this is indeed the fastest and only viable route to lasting peace. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Estonia for their statement, and now I give the floor to the representative of Czechia.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of Slovakia and my own country, Czechia. We also fully align ourselves with the statement to be delivered by the European Union. The end of this month will mark the sad anniversary of the referenda orchestrated by the Russian occupation authorities in the territories of Ukraine. The international community, with only one conspicuous exception, overwhelmingly rejects their legitimacy. These sham referenda were immediately followed by Russia's announcement of the annexation of the Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson regions. This coming weekend, the Russian occupation administration will take yet another illegal step in similar vein. Under the guise of Russian municipal elections, the occupation authorities plan to organize the so-called elections. They are actually already underway. Their underlying objective is quite clear: to lend an aura of legitimacy to the military occupation of Ukraine's sovereign territories. The annexed parts of 4 regions and Crimea are an integral part of Ukraine and are illegally occupied by the Russian invading forces. Such an act of annexation cannot be justified by manipulated votes conducted under the watchful eyes and gun barrels of Russian soldiers. Be it through holding a referendum on annexation or organizing these so-called elections in occupied territories, the Russian Federation once again flagrantly tramples on the basic principles of international law. Both Czechia and Slovakia categorically condemn the annexation, and we do not recognize its legitimacy. The same applies to the staging of the so-called elections in the occupied territories of Ukraine, as they violate the international law. We reiterate our full support for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. We call on Russia once again to stop immediately its aggression against Ukraine and to withdraw its troops from the territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. We will continue to support Ukraine and its citizens in their just defense against Russia's aggression as long as it takes. And we have no doubt that notwithstanding these illegal actions undertaken by Russia, Ukraine will succeed in liberating its entire territory, as it did last year in the Kherson region, merely weeks after the sham referenda. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Czechia for their statement, and I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Olof Skog, head of the delegation of the European Union to the United Nations.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union and its member states, candidate countries North Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, Ukraine, Republic of Moldova, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and the EFTA country Liechtenstein, member of the European Economic Area, as well as Andorra, Monaco, and San Marino all aligned themselves with this statement. Mr. President, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to the Council today, and I also want to thank, like everyone else, Miroslav Jenča for his presentation. And let me say, too, that we pay tribute to the UN country team in Ukraine, many of whom visited New York this week, for the very valuable efforts that they are doing on the ground to alleviate the plight of the Ukrainian people. Mr. President, today I want to emphasize 2 points. Firstly, that Russia's illegitimate so-called elections in territories of Ukraine under temporarily military occupation hold no value under international law. They should not and will not be recognized. And secondly, the dire human rights situation in these territories. Russia has decided to go ahead with its so-called elections in the territories of Ukraine that it has temporarily military occupied. This is yet another manifest violation of international law and a futile attempt by Russia to legitimize its illegal military control and attempted annexation of parts of Ukraine's Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson regions, and the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol. Russia has no legitimate basis for any such action on the territory of Ukraine. By willfully undermining international order based on international law, violating the fundamental rights of Ukraine to its independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity, as enshrined in the UN Charter, Russia is putting global peace and security at risk, as many of you have recognized today. A little less than a year ago, the UN General Assembly overwhelmingly voted to condemn Russia's illegal annexation of Ukraine's territories. With 143 votes in favor and only 5 against, the GA called upon states, international organizations, and UN agencies to not recognize any alteration by Russia of the status of these territories of Ukraine, and demanded that Russia completely and unconditionally withdraws all of its military forces from Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Russia doesn't just block this council from meaningful action, it is also in defiance of the General Assembly. Russia, its political leadership, and all those involved in organizing these illegitimate so-called elections will face consequences for these illegal actions. Mr. President, the illegal so-called elections in Ukraine are taking place amidst Russia's forced and illegal granting of passports, including to children, and widespread and systematic human rights violations in Ukraine's occupied territories. International monitoring mechanisms, including the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine and the Independent International Commission of Inquiry, have concluded that Russia has committed a wide range of violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law in Ukraine. These violations include indiscriminate attacks, as well as intentional attacks against civilians and civilian objects, widespread and systematic summary executions, torture, ill treatment, and unlawful confinement, rape, and other forms of sexual and gender-based violence, and forced transfer and deportation, including of children. The past months, Russia has once again escalated its attacks on civilian objects, including on facilities for the export of Ukrainian grain. Earlier this week, Russia bombed a crowded market in Donetsk region, killing at least 16 people, including a child, and injuring dozens of others. International attacks against civilians are war crimes. All commanders, perpetrators, and accomplices of these atrocities will be held to account. The EU remains firmly committed to ensure that Russia is held fully accountable for its aggression against Ukraine. Furthermore, the Secretary General report on the situation of children in armed conflict lists the Russian army and affiliated armed groups as perpetrators of grave violations against children. These violations include killing and maiming Ukrainian children, mostly caused by airstrikes and attacking schools and hospitals. I express the EU's full support for the work of the UN to monitor and report on human rights violations and abuses and to support efforts towards accountability. In this regard, we welcome the recent visit by the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture to Ukraine. We urge Russia to uphold international human rights and humanitarian law. It must enable full, safe and unhindered humanitarian access to the front lines and stop willingly withholding aid from people in need in Ukraine's occupied territories. We remain unwavering in our support for Ukraine, its sovereignty and territorial integrity. Russia must immediately, completely and unconditionally withdraw all of its troops and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Ukraine is exercising its inherent right to defend itself and to regain full control of its territory. Crimea, Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk and Luhansk are Ukraine, and we call on all states and international organizations to unequivocally reject these illegal elections. Mr. President, in a couple of days, world leaders will descend on New York and they will discuss and recommit to the Sustainable Development Goals. As the rest of the world renews these commitments to assist every country to achieve the goals, Russia's unlawful military assault on Ukraine is not only setting back the ambitions of the Ukrainian population, but it's also putting at peril the fundamental goals of many people in every corner of the world. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Skog for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Italy.
Thank you, Mr. President. Italy fully aligns itself with the statement just delivered by the European Union and would like to add some consideration in its national capacity. Far from being an exercise of democracy and self-determination, the illegitimate so-called elections organized by Russia in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine are taking place amidst widespread and systematic abuses of human rights and intimidation. It is crystal clear that they only represent an attempt to pretend democratic practice while imposing with the coercion and military force Russia's imperialistic plans. Mr. President, let me clear, Italy will never recognize the fabricated results of the illegitimate elections organized by Russia in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, just like Italy did not and will never recognize the illegal attempted annexation of all Ukrainian territories temporarily occupied by Russia, and calls on all states to do the same. We see this not as a discretionary choice for states, but rather as our common obligation under international law. Mr. President, Italy condemns in the strongest possible way Russia's continuous brutal attacks targeting civilian infrastructures and cities across Ukraine, as well as Russia's complete disregard to the call rising from the entire membership to put an end to its full-scale, unprovoked and illegal invasion of Ukraine. There must be no impunity for those responsible for war crimes and other atrocities. Russia will ultimately have to be accountable for the heavy damages caused by its war of aggression. While thanking the UN country team for its extensive work on the ground and for having shared this past week very important insights during its visit to New York, Italy fully supports all the humanitarian actors who are working tirelessly to ensure the protection of the population and that vital assistance is within reach. Rapid, safe and unhindered access to humanitarian assistance for those in need in Ukraine must be guaranteed. Mr. President, Italy is committed to sovereignty, independence, unity and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Support for Ukraine will be one of the key priorities of our G7 presidency next year, and we are determined to continue doing so as long as necessary, aiming to reach a just, comprehensive and lasting peace. We will concentrate on the reconstruction of Ukraine, including by organizing the Ukraine Recovery Conference in Italy in 2025. We will lay the foundations for a prosperous, independent Ukraine within our common European family. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Italy for their statement, and now I give the floor to the representative of Poland.
Mr. President, let me begin by thanking Albania for convening today's meeting and for giving Poland the opportunity to actively participate in it. Let me also thank to Assistant General Miroslav Jeńcza for his very informative briefing on the current situation in Ukraine. Mr. President, we are meeting in an important moment. On one hand, member states come up with various diplomatic initiatives within the aim of finding a path to a just peace in Ukraine. Poland belongs to this group. Recently, together with the representatives of more than 40 countries, we took part in a summit hosted by Saudi Arabia in Jeddah, where we discussed a peace formula proposed by the President Zelensky. On the other hand, contrary to that and other member states' efforts, the aggressive party in the ongoing war, which is the Russian Federation, strives to achieve something opposite. It creates aggressive fait accompli, standing in opposition to the UN Charter. Those acts are of a dual nature, political and military. The political ones are the plans to hold the sham local elections as the follow-up to the sham referenda held almost exactly 12 months ago in the temporarily and partially controlled Ukrainian territories. These Kremlin's actions are undertaken in spite of the 143 member states of this organization clearly voicing their indignation with the Russian pseudo-democratic practices in the GA resolution tied to territorial integrity of Ukraine, defending the principles of the Charter of the United Nations referred today several times. The last year's resolution that I just mentioned called specifically, and I quote, for all states, international organizations and the United Nations specialized agencies not to recognize any alteration by the Russian Federation of the status of any or all of the Donetsk, Kherson, Lugansk and Zaporizhia regions of Ukraine, and to refrain from any actions or dealing that might be interpreted as recognizing any such altered status. As we clearly see today, this plea remains as timely as fully appropriate as a year ago. Poland cannot and will not accept the violations against the territorial integrity of Ukraine and of any other member state. For us, it is an explicitly illegal action. Mr. President, while trying to create the new political fait accompli with a view to legitimize its occupation in the eyes of the international community, Russia continues with its brutal military aggression against civilians in many Ukrainian towns and villages. One of the latest examples was the cruel attack on the crowded market in Konstantinivka. Kremlin also keeps terrorizing the global food supply by continuous attacks on Ukrainian grain storage and port facilities. Mr. President, in the light of the approaching high-level week of the 78th General Assembly session, the just described Russian behavior constitutes a fundamental challenge for the whole United Nations. While we strive to maintain international peace and restore international peace and security, we are forced to deal with a country, a permanent member of this Security Council, which keeps to repeatedly break the very central principles of international law. Its illegal actions have negative spillover effects for the whole international community. Therefore, we must consequently defend the UN Charter, including the overarching principle of territorial integrity being discussed today. This is Poland's main message of peace for the upcoming high-level week, and I thank you.
I thank the representative of Poland for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. This meeting is adjourned.